With the recent revelation that Nintendo is not just doing a new version of Ocarina of Time, but that the legend will be, in their words, reborn, it opens up a massive questions about this new project. I've been talking about a potential Ocarina game for years at this point, but the evidence scope of what we're seeing is very significant, and a comment on Nintendo's own American website caught additional attention while I was finishing this video up, with the company stating that this game is, and I quote, the N64 classic reborn as a full remake for Nintendo Switch 2. Experience Ocarina of Time with stunning visuals, updated designs, and timeless gameplay. Now, the terms remake and remaster carry a lot of meaning for those with deep knowledge of the industry, where a remaster is a development of the source code and a remake is generally a grounds up reconception. But self-evidently, Nintendo hasn't always cleaved to this strict definition, and I think it's understandable that there is some ambiguity. Nintendo, after all, presumably has the original source code for all their major games intact and well, and so theoretically they could use this, but then again, there's no doubt that the visual aspects of the game will be reconceived from the ground up at least, if not the gameplay. At some point, you get into the ship of thesis issue. If every part of the ship has been renewed in the process of fixing it, is it even the same ship? Personally, I usually try to avoid the terms remake or remaster, as I feel they often obfuscate far more than they clarify, but nevertheless, we can see some examples of how Nintendo used them, and I think this will be useful for us in considering the scope that we can expect from Ocarina of Time. Case in point 1, Metroid Prime Remastered. I note that when Digital Foundry first reviewed this game, they felt that the work done on it was so intensive that it could have had a case for calling it a remake, but of course the game was fundamentally exactly the same at heart as the original, even though the graphics were amazing and elements of the controls were revised. This was truly an authentic version, but still a version of the original game remastered. Now, even then, I think marketers at Nintendo of America must have realized that any semblance of calling for a remake of one of their most beloved titles would probably be far riskier to the purists who love it and who would be driving early sales. But in any event, Nintendo has been pretty consistent with their use of the term remastered with respect to Metroid Prime. On the other hand, Nintendo of America's site called Star Fox, the new Switch 2 version here, a remake, though as with so many of these cases, the designation simply isn't that prominent. Notably, this wasn't the terminology used in the launch Direct, the Star Fox Direct, where they described instead the game as being, and I quote, based on the Nintendo 64 game Star Fox 64, but the visuals have been completely updated. Still, much as with Link's Awakening before it, the title doesn't suggest that it's a new version so much as simply that it is the definitive version with the singular title Star Fox, essentially starting a new beginning point for the series. All evidence suggests that the new Star Fox is indeed, in core gameplay, incredibly faithful to what went before, except for those graphical and narrative elements, and other advertising promotes the cinematic aspects of the title. Now, of these two examples, Ocarina of Time is clearly already very obviously towards the Star Fox end of the spectrum in terms of the intensity of the amount of work put into it. But the question is whether it moves beyond the status of Star Fox into a much more radical reinterpretation of the original title. I think the use of the term reborn is a conscious choice to sidestep the whole issue, frankly, and it would make an awful lot of sense for Nintendo to stick to that, but Nintendo of America's reborn as a full remake wording kind of gives the game away, and I do wonder whether there's a greater keenness from their American marketers to push the concept of a remake, which is a more culturally resonant term given the long history of Hollywood adapting remakes and other content, compared to Japan, where they might be a little more cautious. I suspect there might also be a particular caution and cultural sensitivity in Japan about being seen to in any way potentially denigrate or sideline the original game, which of course is a recognized masterpiece, easily one of the most crucial elements of Nintendo's entire game lineup, and of course Reborn has a different connotation than Remake, and I rather suspect the choice of this word would have been worked out with the very senior people at Japan, including Aonuma, and probably their top marketing team. I also think that the quote is clear that the gameplay essentially is timeless, which I read as basically sacrosanct. That's not to say there won't be changes and adaptations, and I'm going to get to that in this video, but even in Link's Awakening, they had 8-directional movement, and while button mapping was slightly less restrictive than on the Game Boy original, it still wasn't possible to use the whole range of the Switch's many buttons to map all the inventory items that were available to you, something which I'm still not quite sure why they didn't implement. These might be small choices, but I think they represent a philosophy that can only have come from the top, in this case from Eiji Aonuma himself, that the irreducible essence of the title's experience should remain broadly the same, even if superficial elements change. I think the descriptions, stunning visuals, updated designs, and timeless gameplay could easily be used to advertise Link's Awakening as well, although I grant you how much the diorama stuns you visually might be a matter of taste. I love it, but I know not everybody does. Note especially that 2 of these elements are essentially graphical, though, in nature. That's not to say that there won't be other elements changed. It's basically inconceivable to me that the controls won't be updated, and I'm sure the game will have a modern camera. But the question that many will ask is, what about expansion? Ocarina's world fell vast in the context of the N64 in 1998, but for those who are used to the Hyrule of the Wild, let alone many other open world games on the market, it's a rather quaint affair. Again, I think we should consider Link's Awakening as a precedent. They weren't completely averse to hacking around with that game, adding in Dunpei's dungeon, but these were largely complementary elements to the main title. Of course, the Game Boy Color added a color dungeon when that game was first given a director's cut, but even that feels like kind of an oddity sticking out in the game, although I appreciate this perception might be my own bias as someone who grew up with the Game Boy original and for whom the color dungeon still feels oddly new. Still, what's notable about the Dunpei sections is that they weren't the afterthought additions, but the forethought. The very reason the game was remade in the first place was to consider implementing some kind of Zelda maker, and the modular Game Boy dungeons provided an effective scaffold for potential dungeon makers to utilize. What then is the impetus for Nintendo to remake Ocarina beyond just to remake Ocarina? I think to understand what approach they're taking here, we really need to get to the bottom of that question, and I believe there are 3 main reasons that we can identify for why at this point they are remaking Ocarina of Time. Firstly, of course, we must acknowledge that commercially this is just an obvious move. Ocarina of Time is one of their best regarded titles of all time, and it's now 15 years since the title was last released, and even then the 3D version was extremely close to the 64 original in most key respects, hardly some grand departure, nor was it even ever intended to be. I don't think Shuntaro Furukawa came down from head office to tell Eiji Aonuma in those terms that they needed a Ocarina of Time remake in order to meet their financial expectations, though. It's more that the Zelda team know that Zelda games are a precious trust that Nintendo have built up over the years, and so ensuring that these games are accessible to the audience in the best possible way is an ongoing challenge. This is slightly different from the Mario games, where Miyamoto has often resisted remakes and adaptations of the games, and they try, for the most part, to experiment and push boundaries unique to the systems where they launch. The Zelda games, though, have a narrative and experiential component and simply suit being updated far more, as they have always chafed against the technological limitations of their day. I don't think Eiji Aonuma needed to be told to make a remade Ocarina so much as that it was independently obvious to, I'm sure, a great many people, both inside and outside of Nintendo, that Ocarina's time had come. The timing works particularly with the Switch 2 representing the biggest technological leap in a Nintendo console since 2012, when, coincidentally, Ocarina 3D had only just released, and with a Zelda film and almost inevitably a theme park attraction being developed for Zelda, it is especially a good moment for Zelda to take a bigger step. Ocarina is the most obvious encapsulation of the Zelda series, and is also part of an established sequence of stories which could be adapted alongside sequels, although I tend to think Twilight Princess has a greater chance of coming out next than Majora's Mask, although we will see. So yes, the commercial imperative is critical. Secondly, though, we know that the Zelda team are at a crossroads, and moving towards Ocarina, I think, particularly suits them right now. Breath of the Wild fought to redefine what a Zelda game could be, and was so successful that their planned DLC evolved into its own title, taking 6 years and a couple of months to finally release. During interviews for Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, the game's director, reflected that he had ideas about the next title in the series, but that he had not even talked to Eiji Aonuma about them yet. Now look, Fujibayashi is a very important figure and is doubtless given a lot of latitude to Nintendo, but I still don't see any other reasonable explanation other than that there was no meaningful movement on the next game at all in 2023 if the top director had not really had a discussion with the top producer about it. But I also don't think the entirety of the Zelda team at EPD3 were at a standstill during this period. Zelda is a critical series for Nintendo, and those development times were only getting longer. Moreover, by 2023, the company was expanding rapidly. It was able to build essentially new development groups around a core of staff for Donkey Kong Bonanza and Tomodachi Life Living the Dream. Whether they did quite the same for Zelda remains to be seen, but there was certainly no financial impediment to doing so, and indeed every financial inducement given Tears of the Kingdom sold 19 million copies practically overnight, despite selling at a record price tag for a first-party Switch game without an attendant accessory. Of course, that's not to say that the production started right away just as Tears of the Kingdom wrapped. Many of the staff brought over to help get Tears of the Kingdom ready moved on to other critical titles like Mario Kart World, and there was more games still to come, but I'm sure Nintendo would have had a next Zelda game in mind, and of course they also had a leader in place already, Daiki Iwamoto. Iwamoto was the director of the DS games and has long been a senior figure in the Zelda group, supervising and directing many titles. But with Fujibayashi taking over the directing reins of the mainline series with Skyward Sword onward, Iwamoto has been focused on shepherding kind of everything else. Notably, Iwamoto was the credited director of Skyward Sword HD, and as well as developing close relationships with Tantalus Media, he was also recently interviewed on the Monolith Soft website, showing his close relationship with that team. So Nintendo has a second leader, a man with deep experience of the property, and who indeed was the assistant director on the original Ocarina of Time back in 1998, and who was involved with the cinematics at that stage. Who better to lead the endeavour of a new version of Ocarina of Time? Of course, Zelda always had multiple projects on the go, with top-down games as well. Even as the A Link Between Worlds group were cannibalized into the Breath of the Wild development team, they managed to outsource to Grezzo with the development of those top-down titles, while Tantalus have managed 2 Wii remasters, and of course we've seen 3 Hyrule Warriors games in 5 different editions over the last decade or so, all of which has helped to keep a regular beat of Zelda content. Therefore, expanding the Iwamoto team, such as it is, would be a natural step, whether this is in the form of building it up entirely, or developing the Monolith team, or indeed tapping more into the skills of Tantalus or something else beside, is something that I will come back to in a separate video. But the point for this video is that it completely fitted where Nintendo was in 2023 to move to a separate group while Fujibayashi prototyped the next concept for the mainline series. Okay, so we're establishing that there were financial imperatives to do a new Ocarina, and that they also had the need and opportunity to expand their core team, and almost certainly under the aegis of one of their most key figures. But what's the third reason I mentioned for recreating Ocarina? And this is the wildcard one, because Nintendo rarely have just these superficial reasons for returning to a title. Link's Awakening was about the dungeon designer. With Wind Waker HD, another Iwamoto-directed project by the way, they wanted to experiment with how to make games in HD since they hadn't done this before. Well, we definitely know that the next Zelda will be the first experience the developers have of working from the ground up in 4K, despite the 4K versions of the Wild titles at the Switch 2's launch showing they have some experience with it. One thing I've long said is particularly crucial to the next phase of Zelda is, well, for the want of a better word, acting. You can see with Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza extremely expressive characterization with their lead characters, and while the cartoony elasticated faces of the Mario universe suit that particularly well, that's not to say that they won't want a far greater scope to explore character expressions with the Zelda series. I think this was relatively one of the weaknesses of the Wild games, and is an obvious area for them to continue to develop. They also need to make a critical decision about visuals. In 2002, the negative reaction to the cel-shaded look of Wind Waker drove Nintendo to create a more grounded look for Twilight Princess, but from Skyward Sword to Breath of the Wild, you could see them finding an accommodation between the two styles that worked for the majority of people. Still, Zelda is a critical franchise for Nintendo in the West especially, and it's the West that generally likes the more realistic look. I suspect that they will still be considering the correct direction for the next mainline Zelda, therefore. Of course, the suggestion that 3 years into the project, potentially, the art direction of the next big game could still be up in the air might be alarming to many people, but it probably shouldn't be. We know that Nintendo focused primarily on the core gameplay mechanics early on and building up prototypes, with the visuals coming far later in production, and of course the story coming pretty much last. Seeing how people respond to quite different takes from the look of the Wild games makes sense, and I don't think they necessarily need to commit to a new look just yet, when they can step back and see how Ocarina of Time is received. More than this, Nintendo has Nintendo Pictures now. Although recently they gained attention for their short Close to You featuring the Pikmin, the reality is that the team was never originally presented as trying to muscle into the movie business imminently, but rather was aiming to provide cinematics for games, including motion capture. Yoshiaki Koizumi, another senior figure of the original Ocarina, is on the board, as well, of course, of being the general manager for the whole of their game development arm, EPD. It's true that Nintendo has often outsourced CGI sequences on their core titles, notably on the Metroid series, where groups like motion capture studio House of Moves Inc. were brought on board. However, Nintendo Pictures has done smaller projects like Super Mario RPG and Another Code Recollection. They were also credited on Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, but notably their only credit in 2.5 years now is for Close to You. They may well be involved in Star Fox, but to me it seems the likeliest project for them by far is Ocarina of Time. The way Nintendo always worked before is that they wanted cinematics to be done last, so that they would seamlessly integrate into the gameplay, the specifics of which were continually being tweaked and improved. The last thing they wanted was to be restricted to gameplay elements that didn't work because they had already sunk lots of money into CGI that now did not fit their requirements, and I think with their mainline original games, that still remains the case. However, Ocarina is the perfect time to experiment with a more cinematic style, as at its core the gameplay elements are now fixed, and so it's possible to imagine Nintendo Pictures being given 2 years to rework the cinematics from the ground up and to help design something which looks truly incredible, including the characters and the world. To me, the June teaser trailer reminded me less of the work of Monolith Soft that we've seen so far, let alone the work of Grezzo, Tantalus, or anyone else Nintendo has tended to work with, but of Close to You. Close to You was at the same time incredibly impressive and incredibly controlled in what it showed. The detailing was incredible, the animation on the baby superb, but it was all set in a very enclosed space with consistent lighting and with most of the objects being inanimate. Now, this trailer also strikes me as extremely controlled in what it shows. The tapestry looks amazing, but essentially the camera is panning and allowing us to appreciate this one sensational asset, while the odd mote of dust shines in the light. Later, Link is asleep, so we can appreciate his design and we can appreciate the beauty of the room. We can look at the great textures on his clothing. It's amazing, but also it's quite restrained. That's not to say that the trailer isn't hugely impressive or that the game won't include more expansive and impressive cinematics still, but I think if you were to draw a line from the cinematics of Another Code and Super Mario RPG through to Close to You, you could see how the line would continue through something like what appears to be the Ocarina of Time that we're seeing in this trailer. I'm sure Nintendo have great aspirations for their pictures division, but they know they're not ready to be making their own cinematic epics from scratch as yet. That said, they have the impetus, they also have Illumination's Chris Maladondra on the board, and so it feels like Ocarina may represent the first wave of what we might call Nintendo's cinematic era, an era where Link's Awakening and Star Fox are also early examples perhaps where they're trying to bring cinematic quality storytelling to existing, successful, proven triumphs of games. The key here, though, is the existing game. If indeed Nintendo Pictures are helming the cutscenes, they are not going to be contributing to the game because, well, the clue's in the name. They're Nintendo Pictures, not Nintendo Gaming. However, we know that the character designs will be different, and this is significant. It's not the case that the Ocarina of Time designs will need to be the only form future Zeldas might take. It's true that the Breath of the Wild designs furnished a sequel and two Warrior spin-offs with a basic look, but Zelda has always been rendered into different styles as the games go by, and to a large degree it's probably beneficial for there to be a visual differentiation between their remake and new titles going forward. However, As we can see from Wind Waker to Twilight Princess to Skyward Sword, it's not just the designs that can be critical, but a whole range of other choices in terms of lighting and shading choices and coloured usage and other things that can have an outsized effect on the final product. Quite how the Zelda team will adapt the visuals of Ocarina for their own ends, I'm not necessarily sure. Even Fujibayashi would know just yet, but it obviously represents a vast head start on the graphics if they can hive off the graphical development of the next Zelda to a separate project with its own funding, and then cannibalize all of this into the next game series, even if they then hack it about with different shading and lighting, but fundamentally the same look. I would guess that this won't stop at Link and Zelda. One area of criticism from the original Breath of the Wild, largely addressed in the sequel, was that the range of monsters wasn't really commensurate with the scale of the world. Ocarina, though, has a very healthy range of enemies, and it's clear to see how cannibalizing them into the next game will be a significant aid to the development of any future Zelda project. They might also want to consider the programming of these creatures if their intention is to make them feel really alive. One of the joys to me of Breath of the Wild is the huge expressiveness and animatedness of the enemies, notably the bokoblins. It never fails to make me smile when a moblin decides to grab a bokoblin to hurl at me. Initiating these kinds of intelligent developments is trickier in an existing game, though, as the sizes of the areas and the design of the areas are all built around the programming of the creatures as they originally were, not as they could be. Therefore, what I might expect to see is a lot of focus not on the way they move, act, and behave, but rather on expression, sound, and micro movements. Small bits of business that mean when you watch enemies from a distance, they seem really part of the world. However, significantly reconceiving the way that they interact with the player, I'm less sure about that. One example of where I think we could see something quite interesting is in the sculptureless webbing. So much of Zelda, especially in recent years, has been about interactivity with the environment and the emergent effects of different properties of the world. Sticky webbing, it strikes me, as something which has enormous potential to make for a terrifying gameplay element if realistically implemented. But also, it is pretty tricky to program in any precise detail, and it would certainly be surplus to requirements in Ocarina, where it's broadly sufficient to know that it's either a barrier, an impediment, or something to burn. However, there is the potential, if they so chose, to go into quite granular detail on the programming of the webbing, with the intention of doing far more with these sculptures in subsequent Zelda games. The fact that the enemies weren't in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom may just be a coincidence, but I rather suspect that Fujibashi had ambitions to do more with them than was necessarily possible or that they had time to do on the Switch. I'm not necessarily saying that we can expect super detailed webbing necessarily, but this is an example of the kind of area where I would expect a surprisingly lavish amount of attention being put in. It's also the case that even the smaller scale world of Hyrule has in microcosm many of the biomes that they will doubtless want in the next title. It's possible, of course, that the next mainline Zelda takes place outside Hyrule. Frankly, I rather hope it does. But even if it does, you can bet that it will involve volcanoes, forests, waterfalls, and deserts, and so while some specific assets might change, much can still be reutilized if it's developed for Ocarina. You can clearly see how it benefits Nintendo to focus on these aspects. Where I'm less sure that it's in Nintendo's interest to focus right now is what the rationale might be for expanding out the world of Ocarina of Time significantly, for designing brand new sections and areas, new dungeons, new interstitial places in the world, for reconceiving any of the locations from the ground up. Setting aside that there's not really a precedent for this in the treatment of new versions of prior games, or that the early blurbs that they've released give no indication of this kind of development, or that they risk the accusations of bloating something that previously worked very well, just from a purely utilitarian perspective, how is this benefiting their long-term plans? Surely any design work of this nature is just going to draw attention from the next full game's development, which they want to be surprising and expansive. If anything, if they're going to do a very trad Zelda through the Switch 2 era with Ocarina and presumably eventually new versions of Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, not necessarily I suspect in that order, then it opens up the possibility that the next main game could be a greater imaginative leap, and so it's all the more imperative that they avoid mission creep on Ocarina and deploy their resources effectively by sweating the locations that are already designed for the game rather than reworking them too significantly. Of course, there are plenty of legitimate things that can be brought into Ocarina, such as the Master Quest elements, which would naturally lend themselves to enriching the offer of what I have no doubt will be, in physical form, an $80 game, they can point to these new elements as an offer of greater depth than just the simple title. And there may be times when they decide, with the benefit of years, that there are new things that can be done, safe in the knowledge that the original is still available on Nintendo Switch Online and will remain so. Eiji Aonuma has been so deeply involved in this series that I think if he had a vision for something he could change, then he would be taken very seriously. But I think, on balance, we're talking very small tweaks. That's not to say I don't see the game expanding in other respects. With Star Fox, we can see particular focus on online and multiplayer elements, including custom avatars for game chat. At the very least, I think there's significant potential that they do something similar with game chat for Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf. Not only is it a logical tie into the movie, but if indeed they have created highly animatable and expressive character models, then they may find the work that they put into implementing this for Star Fox can be reused again. It definitely feels like a much more engaging utilization of game chat than we saw previously, and I don't think they're done with game chat by any means. Last summer I saw one Switch 2 advert that was far more a game chat ad than a console ad, despite the fact that the console had only been out for a few weeks. I've talked separately about why counterintuitively to some of their audience base they do see such a future in game chat, but for now suffice to say that I think they will continue to push this feature for a good while yet. In terms of multiplayer functionality, one obvious element would be to explore the gameplay of a second character, potentially even Zelda. Now, without talking about the plot of Ocarina, the game presents both limitations and opportunities for how it could use Zelda as a gameplay element without ruining twists or disrupting the plot. Nevertheless, following the same principle as why they might want to focus on cinematic design and monster development, it strikes me that if EPD3 hoped to implement some kind of secondary player mechanic in the next Zelda, then it would be just as well to prototype this at a smaller scale beforehand, and Ocarina of Time could give them an opportunity to do just that. However, on balance, I feel like this potentially creates more problems than it might solve. You would need new locations or new adaptations of locations, you'd need to change the game's pacing, and it's not necessarily the case that any control scheme for an Ocarina Zelda would transfer readily to a different game. Link and Zelda have very specific game mechanics in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Echoes of Wisdom, so you'll be creating a whole new control scheme bespoke for one game, knowing that probably the next game would be quite different anyway. And of course, we know that Fujibashi already has an idea of what that might be, so probably he will know whether it's necessary or not to have some kind of experimental playable Zelda prototype. It would be an expensive and complicated endeavour for Ocarina, and again, there would be a high risk that people would feel it actually compromises the original rather than adds to it. I've speculated before, though, that some kind of integration with online would make sense. Super Mario Bros. Wonder did something like this, where you can see live player shadows of other people enjoying the game, something I never personally took advantage of, as it seems rather pointless to me, but it seems like you could have a particular benefit in the context of Zelda as a kind of organic hint system where you can see how other people have tackled particularly opaque puzzles, and potentially giving the opportunity to trade items. It's possible to sync up, perhaps not with everyone on the internet, but maybe with a handful of people via game chat. And if this is the case, you can imagine this being a useful mechanic, not just for the players, but also, frankly, for Nintendo's marketing department. We can already see it in Nintendo's advertising the degree to which they're emphasizing cross-generational gaming and social elements. We know that game share is going to be a significant part of this push. Having Dad able to hop onto the old Switch OLED and appear as a shadow to help the young teen navigate the water temple feels like pure nostalgia maxing of the type Nintendo knows works for them. Of course, I'm not saying that the developers started with the ad campaign in mind, but I also think they understand that their product specification includes appealing to a cross-generational audience, and so this is just a logical implementation of that. It also should be noted that many of these developers are exactly at the age where they would have children of that age that they'd be tackling Ocarina for the first time. Natural equivalents of hint systems such as this are probably a big help to people tackling the game as new, but I also wouldn't put it past Nintendo simply to implement easier modes, as this needs to be their most accessible Zelda game yet, given the massive potential audience who will be delivered by the film in 2027. None of this is to say that Nintendo can't expand the core gameplay elements, perhaps a new subquest or more Skulltula tokens to find. Recall how the new Link's Awakening greatly expanded the secret seashell count. However, you can understand why they're not leading the advertising campaign with Ocarina of Time, now with more Skulltula tokens than ever. Then again, if my speculation is right and they do want to do something more ambitious with the sculptures long term, having a dedicated sculptural challenge area might be something they could add that would bring something different to bear on the game. All things considered, though, my expectation is that any additional elements like this will be, broadly speaking, afterthoughts. Their drivers will be graphical experimentation, asset accumulation, character designs and reactions, and utilizing game chat and game share features. I don't think they have the desire or even the financial imperative to massively rethink how we experience Ocarina of Time. And to be honest, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. It's a classic for a reason. On this channel, I tend to forecast using percentage terms, but in this case, it's quite difficult to meaningfully do so when things are so open to interpretation. There will clearly be some adjustments, but how different is different? I may cycle back to this if I can find a phraseology that can be unambiguously assessed, but this video gives a sense of my broad expectations, although, of course, I might review these things going forward. In a future video, I plan to deep dive a little further into the development group or groups to see what makes sense for who might be behind this title, and so I will also put a pin in that line of discussion for now. However, for early ad-free and exclusive content, please do consider checking out the Patreon. For now though, thanks so much for watching, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.